Hello friends, and welcome back to this course titled as British Poetry. We are on Unit 5 doing John Milton's Paradise Lost, and we are now in the last lecture of Unit 5. Today we are going to discuss a very interesting topic from this book Paradise Lost. The title of that topic is John Calvin's Free Will and Predestination, and how these two concepts of free will, of predestination are related to our book Paradise Lost. In this 30 minutes lecture, you are going to, examine the theology of John Calvin in reference to Milton's religious beliefs. Friends, theology is a field which works in religious studies, and John Calvin was a theologist, and his opinions on theology, his critical views on Christianity or religion had helped a lot in understanding John Milton's concept of religious beliefs, because there is a question, a confusion that whether John Milton was a religious person or a not religious person, because at the time of John Milton the Roman Catholics were dominating and John Milton was a Protestant, and there are references where John Milton had criticized Protestants as well, suggesting that John Milton do not want to keep any middleman, do not want to keep any mediator between his approach towards God. He wants to directly communicate to the God through his intellectuality, through his will, through his knowledge, and through his books. So, let us try to understand the concepts of John Milton through the lens of John Calvin's free will and predestination. Samuel Johnson, 2 centuries ago, noted that Milton's theological opinions can be said to have been first Calvinistical, and afterwards, perhaps, when he began to hate the Presbyterians, to have tended towards Arminianism. Friends, you may find these, topics, these words as little confusing. Calvinistical or Presbyterians or Arminianism, basically these concepts are the concepts of theology. And when we are looking at a writer from religious perspective, from theological perspective, then we have to use these words to understand the ideology or the religious stand of any writer. In a more recent work by Julia Walker on Milton and his ideas of free will and necessity, she concludes that, and I give the reference of Julia Walker, what she has to say about the Christianity of John Milton, and I quote, "Milton, the artist, could not accept the reality of Milton, the theologian, who so unambiguously set forth God's is sufficient to have stood, though free to fall speech. So the artist created a human, poetic reality which made Adam's and Eve's actions believable and understandable." Friends, this critique, she has to say that John Milton as an artist is different from John Milton as a theologian. Milton has that kind of objective approach. When he creates, the portrait of Adam and Eve, he is not a Christian, but he is an artist, which is why, it is believable and understandable that the actions which are created in this story Paradise Lost are the poetic realities of an artist, but not the realities of a religious person. So, what are we to understand by Milton's internal conflict between his poetic sensibility and his theological beliefs? Friends, when we read these two quotations, which we had read in the earlier slide, we can understand that there was a conflict in the mind of Milton. There was a dilemma in the mind of Milton. At once, he thinks like a Christian. At another time, he thinks like an artist. And in both these, let's say, identities, Milton is knitting the new poetic works into his life. Furthermore, would a further investigation into this conflict suggest an answer to whether Milton actually later in his life did drift towards the Arminian theology? Friends, we can also, let's say, assume from these quotations that earlier Milton was simply an artist, but when he became blind and vulnerable, he was, let's say, more religious person. Arminian theology was adapted by his mind. As a blind person, he was dependent on others. Thus, he did a complete sacrifice for God. He devoted his complete personality towards, let's say, God's identity. By examining Milton's earlier work, Areopagitica, and his later epic Paradise Lost, we can understand how he felt about free will and necessity, and if he did actually undergo a theological shift. Friends, Milton had written, let's say, a very popular work, Areopagitica, where he justified the freedom of press or the freedom of individual ideas. And later he wrote Paradise Lost, where he again talks about the fall of man because of his free decision from the supremacy of God. Suggest that Milton was, let's say, moving towards a theological drift into his ideas. Lastly, I will investigate how his ideas about the free will and necessity then uniform his views of the human condition before and after the fall in Paradise Lost. So, in this lecture, we will also try to investigate that how, let's say, the free will and necessity are then later uniformed in his, let's say, views of human condition before, let's say, Paradise Lost and after the fall in Paradise Lost. How Milton is able to make a balance between both these conditions as a theologian and as an artist. One of the earlier Protestant reformers, John Calvin, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, this is a book written by John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, developed his 5 points of Calvinism, which includes his discourses on free will and necessity. Friends, this person, John Calvin, was a Protestant reformer. He was again against Roman Catholic approach of supremacy of church, and thus he is a very rational person of his age, rational theologian. And when he created a discourse of free will and necessity that applied directly to the ideology of John Milton. First, Calvin believed that God not only foresaw the fall of man but also arranged it. So, Calvin says, and I quote, "Nor ought it to seem absurd to say that God not only foresaw the fall of the first man and in him the ruin of his posterity, but also at his own pleasure arranged it." Friends, this is a question which can always come in your and my mind, that God created paradise everything was perfect in that paradise. Adam and Eve were living happily in that paradise. Then why did God create the tree of knowledge there? And then God forbade Adam and Eve to eat the fruit of knowledge from that tree. If the tree was of no use, then why did God create it? Why did God take a chance to take pleasure of Adam and Eve eating that fruit and going for their downfall on earth? Maybe we can believe that God is feeling pleasure in the fall of the first man, and maybe all these things are created by God Himself. Second, Calvinism teaches that man's will is subject to God's will. So, when man does will something, Calvin and his followers would argue that God has already willed it beforehand for his own pleasure. This, of course, would include God's will for salvation. Friends, this is right. When we see that, when we think that God is omnipotent, omnipresent, exists everywhere, supreme powerful, then how can Adam and Eve decide anything on their own? Maybe that it was pre-decided by God Himself, and thus this free will has nothing to do with the life of Adam and Eve. Rather, it was their destiny pre-decided by God, and God is going to will that beforehand for His own pleasure. God's will for salvation can be the root cause of that. How? Let's say if Adam and Eve, they are, let's say, fallen on earth, then they will think about salvation. Then they will think about moving again back to paradise. They will work hard for that. They will put an effort for that. They will remain on goodness. They will work on that path of goodness, and they will avoid evil into their life, suggesting that God Himself wanted Adam and Eve to fall on earth. Calvin's doctrine on free will propagates that man cannot even will to be reconciled to God. Friends, when we read the ideas of this theologian Calvin, we feel that human beings cannot even reconcile to God. They do not have actually a free will. Rather, they are completely dependent on the authority and on the orders of God. In fact, it is only by God's irresistible grace, a grace that cannot be refused, that God chooses whoever He pleases to be reconciled to Him. Maybe we can say that God wants to choose that who is going to please God. So it's the, let's say, freedom of human beings, whether they wish to go on good or bad. If they choose good, then they will please God, and thus God will be reconciled. Otherwise, they will be punished by God if they choose the path of evil. In Milton's Paradise Lost, especially the book that deals with Adam and Eve before and after the fall, Milton is more an Arminian than a Calvinist. Friends, when we look at this book Paradise Lost, we feel that this is something, the story of Adam and Eve is something which is, let's say, more suggests that Milton is more Arminian than Calvinist. He is near to, let's say, Arminians, Armenian idea, Armenian ideology than Calvinist ideas. This is so because grace is offered to all mankind. And in addition to that, man is responsible for the fall, not a predetermining or causative God. So, we can believe, friends, that grace is offered to all mankind. It is the, let's say, freedom of any human being to choose the grace of God or not. In addition to that, Man is responsible for the fall. Friends, this story Paradise Lost also suggests that Adam and Eve themselves chose to suffer on earth. It was not the decision of God, not a predetermined or causative God. God is not, let's say, deciding all these things. So in this way, we can say that the Armenian concept of free will, free choice, self-decision taken by Adam and Eve applies more to this book Paradise Lost than the supreme authority of God and God persuading Adam and Eve to choose eating the fruit of knowledge. In book 3 of Paradise Lost, Milton poetically deals with the present idea, which is that God's foreknowledge does not impose any necessity upon us. So, when we look at book 3 of Paradise Lost, we see that poet is dealing with the present idea. What is that idea? That God foreknowledge does not impose any necessity upon us. So, it suggests that God do not possess human beings. God do not dictate human beings. God do not, let's say, force human beings to do something. Rather, God prefer more watching what human beings are doing in their life. After God reveals to the Son that Satan will take revenge on men, and in defense of men, God will redound upon his one rebellious head, God also reveals to the Son how men will be perverted by the lies of Satan to fall. Friends, there is a discussion between God and the Son of God, Christ, where God is clarifying that he, let's say, would like to see redound upon his once rebellion, upon his one rebellious head. God wished to see that how these people rebel with God and how God is going to, let's say, pervert all these things. And these are the lines which I quote from the poem suggesting the Satan to fall. And I quote, "For men will hearken to his glozing lies and easily transgress the sole command, sole pledge of his obedience. So will fall he and his faithless progeny, whose fault, whose but his own, integrate he had to me. All he could have, I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood. Though free to fall, such I created all the ethereal powers and spirits, both them who stood and them who failed. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell." In this, let's say, line from the poem, God is clarifying that he cannot force any one of his creation, whether it is Satan or Adam and Eve, to choose, let's say, good only and the supremacy of God. God had given complete freedom to these people, these creations. If they want their downfall, then they should choose evil. If they want their upliftment, closeness to God, then they should choose the goodness. So, this is the decision of these characters, that to which way they should follow. Milton's disagreement with Calvin's belief that God took pleasure in arranging the fall is also evident in the following passage. We have, friends, few more examples from the poem where Milton is, let's say, disagreeing with Calvin's belief that God took pleasure in arranging the fall. How it is that? Let us read it from the poem. God says in book 3, "What pleasure I from such disobedience paid, when will and reason also is choice. Useless and vain of freedom both despoiled, made passive both, had served necessity, not me. They therefore, as to right belonged, so were created, nor can justly accrue their makers and their making or their fate as if predestination overruled. God here says that why would he enjoy the downfall of these creatures? Why would he expect them to be obedient towards him? There is no concept of predestination created by God, and it is the free will of these characters which overrule the concept of predestination. They have to decide on their own whether they wish to spoil their future or build up their future. This passage also examines that Danielson had reiterated earlier, that is Arminius' argument against Calvin's idea that irresistibly grace is for the elect only, so that God alone, in which holding grace, would be responsible for those who perish without salvation. So, this concept also, let's say, criticized by a critique, Danielson, and he says that so what God alone in that holding grace would be responsible for those who perish without salvation. He says that why is God responsible for those characters who perish without salvation? It is the will of those characters to choose evil. They do not need salvation, they do not need freedom, and they want to revolve again and again into that cycle of life and death. Thus, those people are themselves responsible for their, let's say, misery, for their suffering. Furthermore, Milton says God does not take pleasure in man's disobedience to sin. And if any idea of necessity is caused, it happens when man chooses to be obedient to Satan instead. So, we can say that Milton's God do not take, let's say, pleasure in man's disobedience. Rather, it is Satan who is taking pleasure in that. If these, let's say, human beings, they are towards Satan, in the side of Satan, then they have to suffer in their life. So, where is God fault in that? And by doing so, man serves necessity and not God. In addition, by Milton choosing his diction as such, nor can justly accuse their maker or their making or their fate, the poet expresses an Arminian theology. In this way, we can assume that Milton's concept is more related to Arminian than John Calvin's concept. There is nothing like predestination. The characters can choose their own path, their own downfall or upgradation. In addition, by Milton's choosing his diction as such, nor can justly accuse their maker or their making or their fate. So, nobody in this life, according to Milton, can, let's say, blame God for their circumstances. They themselves are responsible for that. Their maker is not responsible for their sufferings, but their own acts. And thus, Milton is somewhere near to Arminian theology. Milton expresses an Arminian view that man has the free will to either choose or reject obedience to God, and by doing so, man is made responsible for his decision to serve either Satan or God. So, we can understand that it is, let's say, human beings' responsibility to choose between God or Satan. For Milton's God also says, and here I quote from Book 2, line 125 to 131, where God is giving this statement, I else must change their nature and revoke the high decree, unchangeable, eternal, which ordained their freedom, their themselves ordained their fall. Self-tempted, self-depraved, men fall deceived by the other first, men therefore shall find grace. So, in these lines, God is saying that men must learn from their bad experiences, that why they must not choose the path of Satan or evil. They are self-tempted, self-depraved, and thus they must learn from their experiences how they are deceived by others first, and after that they will find the grace of God in their afterlife. Milton expresses his concern that by men's freedom did men ordain his fall, and Milton does not seem to agree with the Calvinistic doctrine that God took pleasure in arranging it. Friends, we can say that Milton is a little more rational than Calvin's concept of destiny, predestiny. Why would God feel pleasure in arranging sins, in arranging sufferings for a human being? Milton says God reacts to men's foreseeable fall by his plan of grace, and it is by this action that we understand more clearly Milton's disagreement with Calvinism. Milton's idea of grace is not irresistible but conditional upon men's choice to accept or refuse it. Milton's God says to Son in Book 3, "Men shall not quite be lost, but saved who will, yet not of will in him, but grace in him." So, God has made clear his stand in the work of Milton that they will be saved by the grace of God, not by their free will. There seemed to be an element of Calvinism here, since we are told that yet not of will in him, but grace in him. However, this does not neglect men's choice to make a decision to be saved by the grace of God. Friends, we see that God is, let's say, believing in the supremacy of himself, which is why he says that men cannot be saved by their will but by the grace of God, suggesting that God wants to give their grace to human beings, but it is human beings who do not choose that path. For Milton, man does not have the will to save himself, but can choose to be saved by a will that can save him. This, of course, only pertains to Adam and Eve after the fall and not before. Friends, when we look at this story, we see that the will to save himself but cannot choose to be saved by a will is a concept which says, let's say, reflect the supremacy of God and not the will. Will can be changed by Adam and Eve, but they have to think rationally for that. Whether they wish after their fall for the grace of God or they are happy in their life on earth. This is a decision which will be taken by Adam and Eve only. If we consider the context of Adam and Eve before the fall, it seems that Milton presents them with an impaired will. So, we can see in the personality of Adam and Eve, friends, that they are with impaired will. There is no pair of will in them. They do not wish to decide anything with their, let's say, consultations, discussions. Rather, they have a different kind of will. Adam and Eve are made different by God. However, whether Milton's choice to do so supports Calvin's idea that after the fall, man's will become contaminated so much that he could not even make an informed choice to be saved, is not the theology that Milton irresistibly accepts. When we look at, let's say, Milton's choice to support Calvin's idea after the fall of man's will, we see that he could not even make an informed choice of what is right or what is not right done by Adam and Eve. Rather, the theology that Milton irresistibly accepts is the theology of rationality. Milton wished to give freedom to Adam and Eve. What will be their decision in their afterlife? When they will come to earth, It will be their stand whether they wish to again go to paradise under the grace of God or not. In Book 9, before Eve and Adam are deceived into serving necessity, Adam reminds Eve that but God left free the will and reason he made right. This is the statement given by Adam, suggesting that God has given a free will to Adam and Eve, and it is the reason which will make them right or not. They have to choose between sin and goodness, and this will be considered as their reason, their rationality. So in this way, friends, we can see and understand that Milton is not believing in the supremacy of God. Rather, he is leaving it to human beings whether they wish to live under the grace of God or under the, let's say, supremacy of Satan. Rest lies on the decision of Adam and Eve after their downfall on earth. With this, I complete Unit 5. That is all for today. Thank you for listening.